Thanks so much. All right, welcome everyone again. This is the monthly meeting of the interest group in climate and sustainability within the Open Source Science Initiative. I will start sharing a couple of slides just to give a bit of context. Not everybody, I guess, has been here before. So just give me a quick second. There we go. So just to give a couple of details about this group and what it does. This is an interest group within the larger initiative. The group in particular has been around for about 2 years. The main mission of the group is to facilitate reproducible software development and deployment in anything that rotates around Earth modeling. And obviously the first half of this mission is something that we share with open source science in general. There's many more interest groups that you can go and check out if you like. These in particular is dedicated, as I say, to anything that orbits around sort of environmental, climate, weather, sciences, etc. The activities that have been carried out so far are all around this sort of support for people, either sort of internal people and some of our sponsor organizations or external people, it does not really matter, that want to open source their software, bring it out, make it known to community, showcase it once it's ready for that. But also for people who are looking for collaborations or for looking for functionalities they haven't got, they don't know what to do. So it's essentially just a rally point for people that have interest in developing software or people who have requirements for software that does some sort of environmental modeling. And we just started, so we've touched on a number of different things, but today for this meeting, we would like to start on a new theme around extremes and anomalous behavior. And I would just say, one-liner, I don't know, obviously everyone's background in this call, in a very, short one-liner about this. If you have a physical system, generally what happens when an extreme trajectory emerges is that you have a lot of degrees of freedom, a lot of interacting parts, and they're aligning in some specific way, they're resonating together. That makes it a huge computational grand challenge because not only do you have to model all of these different parts and the way they interact with each other accurately, then in this huge combinatorial haystack, you're looking for a specific needle for when they do something of interest. And no other place I can imagine how you need for software that is validated, that's reproducible, that's scalable, and where an open source aspect could really be the differentiating factor. And so the way we're kickstarting this is what basically going through a big showcase of different packages that already exist and are mature and available for people to use. And in particular, today we have Professor Paul Ullrich to present, along of course his collaborator, to present the package Tempest Extremes. Paul is a climatologist who works at the University of California at Davis, and he's also a faculty scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And he works on a number of topics in climate modeling, but in particular around how you identify and characterize extremes. And so having said this, I would leave the floor to him, and we'll have a chance, so we'll have a few minutes at the end for him to take questions, etc.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Let me get my slides up. Can everybody see that okay?
Perfect.
Great. I should probably also note that my primary position right now is as climate resilience lead at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. All Lawrence Berkeley Lab and Lawrence Livermore Lab are actually fairly close to one another. And so I have positions at kind of all three institutions. To add a little bit more background, I actually have a bachelor's degree in computer science from University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Canada, and basically spent many years as a software developer, software engineer, and have consequently lent that expertise to the realm of climate science. And so where I kind of found my niche was developing software products that really would be useful for high throughput climate data processing and analysis. And that's lent me in a whole bunch of different directions, including leadership of the Hyperfastest project, which is actually completely unrelated to software development, but is an opportunity to work with stakeholders in order to identify their climate data needs and talk to them about how we can make climate data more usable. My primary funding for this comes from the US Department of Energy, but NASA also funded Tempest Extremes early in its development, so it needs to be included as well. Tempest Extremes is a big collaboration between many different folks, and I always hear about folks interested in potentially collaborating new functionality or suggesting new functionality. So if you have ideas on that you would like to see come to fruition in the Tempest Extremes package, please let me know. My primary co-developer with this is Colin Zarzicki, who was actually my lab mate in graduate school at University of Michigan, and together we kind of identified this need for high throughput feature detection and characterization, and have been developing this package since 2014 in order to meet that need. I also want to highlight some of my graduate students that have worked on this, including Yushan Han. Sorry, one second. Beth McClenny, Marielle Pinheiro, Alan Rhodes, who have all contributed over the course of their PhDs to various functionality within Tempest Extremes, as well as using it to address science questions, as well as collaborators Kevin Reed, Alyssa Stansfield, Karthik Belagru, Malcolm Roberts, Daeyeon Kim, Yumin Moon, William Booz, and Vishnu Nair, who, as you can see, have addressed many different features or leveraged this package for various needs. So Tempest Extremes, again, is a feature detection and characterization tool. Basically, what that means is that we take in climate data that would naturally be produced by the climate models and identify extreme weather features within that. And that requires basically loading in every climate field at every time slice and rapidly going through those in order to identify where exactly there's features and then computing various quantities related to those features. My background is actually in C++ development, so I leverage that C++ expertise in order to build an MPI, or basically a parallelized tool then to do this high throughput data processing. So everything is command line based. It's based in Unix. You can, of course, access it through usage of the system tool in Python. We have a kind of preliminary Python interface as well in order to access these tools, but it hasn't been exhaustively tested. So I'm not sure whether I want to recommend that for more broader use. And as mentioned, basically high throughput and significant configurability are kind of two of the core design principles that went into this software. So there's a bunch of executables that make up the Tempest Extremes workflow. It started with detect nodes, which is basically a routine that can be used to detect nodal features, that is, features at a point. I want to contrast these with aerial features, which you'll see later. Those are things that are basically blobs or regions which correspond to a given feature. Detect nodes is paired with its companion stitch nodes, which basically so detect nodes basically detects nodal features at every time slice in parallel, and then stitch nodes basically connects those together in time. Once you have these node files that are produced by these tools, you can then edit them, filter them, compose them, and basically do a bunch of data processing operations that can then assist with better understanding the environment or nature of those different features, as well as computing things like frequency histograms. On the aerial feature side, we refer to these aerial features as blobs, kind of informally. But we have corresponding tools like detect blobs, persistent blobs, stitch blobs, and blob stats, which are targeted for various types of aerial features. In addition to this, we also found a need for doing data processing operations in order to make things more streamlined for the user. And so we have functionality that roughly mimics that of, for instance, climate data operators, CDO, or the NetCDF data operators, and NetCDF. I don't even recall what it stands for. The NCO operators, or NetCDF climate operators, sorry. And so we have tools that are built in basically in order to allow for rapid data processing as well, and performing some of the operations that I found kind of harder to find out there among available software packages, including vertical interpolation, Fourier filtering, and rapid quantile calculations over large data sets. Okay, so let's look at some of the plots that come out of basically feature tracking. So the most obvious nodal feature that kind of started us off with all this work is tropical cyclones. And so tropical cyclones have generally a fixed position in space corresponding to the location of their eye. And that location in space, of course, evolves in time. So what we see over here on the left-hand side is a track of the strongest tropical cyclone produced via the E3SM global Earth system model. And so early on, we see here at the right-hand side that it's of tropical storm strength, and it evolves through a hurricane and then a major hurricane through this magenta color before eventually dissipating west of the Philippines. With these tracks in hand, you can then extract various quantities related to the environment or the feature itself. For instance, looking at overland precipitation associated with tracked storms over the eastern and seaboard of the US, as well as the Gulf Coast. You can do this globally as well in order to assess what fraction of total precipitation globally in each region comes from tropical cyclones, or you can look at characteristics of composited storms, that is basically taking those snapshots of individual storms and overlaying them on top of one another in order to see kind of what the structure is of these features. So on the bottom here, we see extratropical cyclone composites among the strongest extratropical cyclones that appear in the northern hemisphere. And what you generally see is that precipitation rate tends to be maximized just to the north of the core. And you can see the general cyclonic characteristics associated with this feature, as well as the temperature advection that one would normally associate with those extratropical cyclones. And you can look at characteristics such as the integrated vapor transport associated with these storms as well, again, giving you a better idea of the basic structure, character, and environment associated with these storms. Another feature that we look at quite extensively with this package is atmospheric river events, which are effectively regions of long, narrow regions of enhanced vapor transport in the atmosphere, typically associated with cold frontal systems. These are global systems, generally with about 5 occurring over any particular latitude band in the extratropics at any given time, and they're responsible for extreme precipitation, particularly along the west coast of continents, particularly here in the western US, where I'm, of course, host. With our aerial feature tracker, Detect Blobs, we have a ARDT, or AR detection and transport, or just a method for basically detecting these atmospheric river objects, which is based on calculating the Laplacian of the IVT field. This particular detection algorithm I usually highlight in this talk because it shows some of the flexibility that is present within the Tempest Extremes package itself. Tempest Extremes itself does not have any hard-coded functionality for particular features, but instead all of this can be specified on the command line by the user. So if we're interested in writing an algorithm that calculates the Laplacian of the integrated vapor transport field, and then thresholds that based on some particular fixed threshold that the user prescribes, we can then do that very simply on this command line with this threshold command. So here we have an operation here which calculates the vector magnitude of the eastward and northward components of the integrated vapor transport, and then computes the Laplacian on that with some some flexibility in how exactly that operator is defined here, defined by these curly braces. We then threshold that based on values of this field, which are then less than or equal to negative 20,000 kilograms per meter per second squared, which is the units associated with the integrated vapor transport per degree squared, which comes from the Laplacian operator. We then apply additional criteria such as minimum absolute latitude of 15 degrees in both hemispheres, and then filter those features whose area are greater than or equal to 40,000 square kilometers. So again, what I want to emphasize here is this, again, flexibility in specifying these parameters on the command line, as well as the fact that you can actually specify these units in physical units here, square kilometers, rather than number of grid cells. And as a consequence, a command such as this would be agnostic to the grid or the data format that's actually that actually contains the IVT data. Depending on how you vary your model resolution, you can run high resolution or low resolution, you would still effectively be able to use the exact same command line in order to perform that detection. Here's another snapshot of atmospheric rivers that are detected by this algorithm. In addition, regions of high IVT are typically associated with tropical cyclones. And so what we can actually do is combine the nodal and aerial feature detection capabilities within Tempest Extremes, track these tropical cyclones, and build masks around these areas where there are tropical cyclones, and effectively subtract that from the AR field. As a consequence, you actually extract or remove those tropical cyclones that may be confused for atmospheric river objects, and thus get atmospheric rivers that are non-tropical cyclone related. And so there's various workflows that one can come up with effectively in order to extract the features that are meaningful to your particular analysis. Here's another snapshot of using this capability on an unstructured grid. So here, this is what's known as the North American Regionally Refined Mesh, which is used in E3SM in order to do targeted simulations over the North American continent. As well, we also ran a regionally refined model using the weather research and forecasting model, a regional climate model using which is the weather research and forecasting model driven by ERA 5 boundary conditions here, and then detected atmospheric rivers in both a low resolution unstructured mesh on the CubeSphere grid, the North American RRM, and in this region defined by the dynamically downscaled model, the WRF run as well. And then we composited the frequency of atmospheric rivers in each of those simulations, here from the RRM, here from the low resolution model, and here from the WRF model, where you can actually see the boundary of that regional climate model in the detection of atmospheric rivers in order to compare basically atmospheric river frequency in these different model runs. And what you can see here is that Tempest Extremes is very flexible in terms of which data it can actually use in order to perform this feature detection. So whether or not you have this kind of unusual unstructured mesh, perhaps a more normal unstructured mesh, or you can even imagine here a regular latitude longitude mesh, or a dynamically downscaled simulation performed with a regional climate model, you can perform the same atmospheric river detection in each of those environments. We also do aerial feature tracking in Tempest Extremes. So, for instance, Alan Rhodes does this quite extensively to understand how atmospheric rivers are changing into the future. On the left-hand side here, we show a masked region with an atmospheric river object that stretches across the Pacific, with only those regions in color showing where Tempest Extremes has identified an atmospheric river object. We can then identify the core of the feature. We can then use that in order to extract a nodal centroid associated with the feature, and can track those nodal centroids in time, or we can use an overlap criteria in order to track the aerial feature forward and backwards in time, accounting for basically mergers or splits of those atmospheric river objects, and then use that in order to produce these composites of atmospheric river tracks across the Pacific in order to better understand whether or not there's groupings associated with those tracks, for instance, or whether or not the most extreme atmospheric rivers come from particular regions of the Pacific. Again, the command line for this detection is straightforward. On the top left-hand side here, you see another example of that atmospheric river method being applied. Here, we use the dotted lines in order to indicate tropical cyclones that have also been detected in the flow and have been removed from the AR detection. We also have algorithms available in order to do blocking detection. And here, the blocking detection algorithms are basically based on exceedances of 500 hectopascal geopotential height above basically the seasonal normative value in order to actually compute these blocking, whether or not a 500 hectopascal field exceeds its climatological blocking. We use a much of functionality based in Tempest Extremes. You can read about it in our V2.1 paper, but basically it requires us to calculate long-term daily mean climatologies, basically climatologies associated with each day of the year, perform Fourier filtering on that in order to extract a time series, a smoothed time series over the 365 days, and then identify when the 500 hectopascal height exceeds the standard deviation of that climatology for each day of the year. So it's very much based in the atmospheric blocking literature on how one would go about detecting the presence of these blocking events. As mentioned, we have many data analysis operators also built in, calculating things like long-term daily, monthly, or seasonal mean climatology, Fourier filtering in space and time, quantile and percentile calculations. This is what I think is particularly useful from Tempest Extremes because there's very few tools out there that can actually process large data sets and compute quantiles accurately from those data sets. So when I'm running, for instance, quantile calculations over ERA 5 data from 1980 through 2020, trying to do such an operation in Python usually ends up with an out-of-memory error pretty rapidly. However, with this tool, we have the capacity to do basically parallelization in the computation of these quantiles and are able to do the processing even on 40 years of hourly ERA 5 data in about 10 or 20 minutes on the kind of computing systems that we use here at Department of Energy. And as well, I want to emphasize the high throughput data processing capabilities, some of which I'll mention later. Okay, so that's an overview of basically what we can do with the package. I want to go into some of the technical details associated with the package as well and why we've made those decisions. We want to one of the core design principles of Tempest Extremes is that we want folks to be able to work with unstructured grids in the same way that they would work with regular latitude, longitude data. Climate models nowadays are increasingly going towards native grids, getting away from the usage of regular latitude, longitude grids, and are even avoiding providing regridded data to regular latitude, longitude grids because of the computational burden associated with that regridding operation. As a consequence, we want to be able to work directly on the native grids for a variety of reasons. In order to make the usage of these native grids as opaque to the user as possible, we use physical principles that are designed to be grid agnostic in both space and time. So for instance, we use great circle distance throughout Tempest Extremes, not relying on any sort of latitude, longitude grid calculation. And we also encourage users to specify time as physical units. So for instance, durations of 24 hours instead of 6 time steps, as specifying temporal filtering operations via number of time steps could be sensitive to whether or not you're dealing with 6-hour data or perhaps coarsened daily data. There's also some support for physical units, although I would say that there's still some work to be done in that. Basically, if you have a units attribute in your netcdf file, such as hectopascals associated with your vertical model level, then Tempest Extremes can go in and use that information in order to extract which model levels data you want to actually use in your operation. The unstructured grids themselves are incorporated in Tempest Extremes via what we refer to as connectivity files. These are basically ways of encoding the connectivity information between grid cells in files where the data is normally stored basically as a one-dimensional array, where that one dimension spans and basically any arbitrary arrangement of faces over the sphere. So here are an example connectivity file, such as we would see for this hexagonal mesh on the top left-hand side here, may have a number of grid cells associated with it. And for each line, we have basically one set of connectivity information for a particular grid cell. This one refers to the center grid cell here. So it provides the longitude and latitude of the grid center. The cell area, which is important for computing things like these geophysical filters on extreme objects, such as, again, the atmospheric river area filter that you saw earlier in this talk. and then the number of grid cells and the indices of the corresponding grid cells. So again, one line for each grid cell in the file, and this allows us to then perform our algorithmic analysis and perform a number of analysis operations over the unstructured grid, again, with the user not needing to know much about how exactly that grid is oriented. We also highly leverage KD trees in our algorithms in order to perform high throughput calculations over these unstructured grids. And the KD tree basically is a fancy algorithm that allows you to very quickly find distances between points on some manifold, in this case on the sphere. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to extract all the points that are within 5 degrees great circle distance of a particular region in latitude, longitude, space. We would then use the KD tree in order to find all of those points that correspond or that can be found within that particular distance. And it does so very rapidly. All right, so I'm going to get into some of the technical details associated with nodal feature tracking and Tempest Extremes just to explain basically how the algorithm works. On the left-hand side here, I again have some unstructured grid here using hexagons, and I want to highlight this particular feature in the center. So let's say we're interested in tracking a low pressure system that's actually present on the unstructured grid. The numbers here correspond to some units. Let's say it's some sort of non-dimensional sea level pressure unit or something like that. And so what you can see from here immediately is that this one in the center here has the lowest pressure among all of its neighbors. Now, when you're dealing with very large data sets, it's not going to be immediately visually distinguishable where exactly those low pressure systems may be located. And so this is very much a toy example, but it does make it easy to explain what exactly is going on under the hood in Tempest Extremes. Tempest Extremes for parallelization uses what is known as MapReduce, which is a paradigm defined by Google. And basically the process is you break up your analysis into a series of, or a sequence of parallelizable, embarrassingly parallelizable mapping steps, which allow you to basically detect low pressure systems at every time slice, and then use a reduce operation, which is relatively fast, performed in serial, in order to actually track those features in time. Basically, combine all the information from this parallel job running over individual time slices. So the first step is to detect these nodes. Here we're going to search by minimum over this phi field. And the first step of that basically means for every grid cell, look at its immediate neighbors and find all those grid cells that are smaller than their immediate neighbors. For this particular grid, we see that there are actually two instances, or two obvious instances where that's the case, and that's number 1, number 2 here, which are both lower than their immediate neighbors. You can then perform additional low-level filters in order to remove these features as well, such as, for instance, a minimum latitude requirement. We also have then perform merging on those candidates. And so here we say, for instance, if you have multiple candidates within 4 degrees great circle distance, then only take the deepest feature from that particular radius. So since this 1 and 2 are both within 4 degrees great circle distance of one another, we look at both of those and say, okay, we only want to retain the 1 here because it is a deeper feature than the 2 feature, even though both of them are local minimums and minima in space. And then core to the detection functionality is this closed contour criteria. And so closed contours are a way of defining in physical terms whether or not your low pressure system is an isolated loop. And so this technique basically says, looking in the neighborhood of a particular low pressure, we want to be able to draw a contour around that low pressure region that is completely contained within a circle of a given distance. If, for instance, that contour were to stretch outside of that region, then it's not an isolated low, and so may not be the type of feature that we're interested in. In order to detect these closed contours, we use a breadth-first search approach. So we start with our candidates, our low-pressure candidates, and then we start looking at those neighbors, making sure not to revisit neighbors that we've already visited. And what we want to do is make sure that we can transit basically to neighbors and neighbors of neighbors without actually leaving that circle, and while maintaining some values underneath the phi equals 4 contour or delta phi equals 4 contour that is indicated here. And so here on the left-hand side, you can notice that this phi equals 4 contour is completely contained within the 4-degree great circle distance specified on the command line here. And as a consequence, this passes the filter for a isolated candidate. On the bottom right-hand side here, we have an instance where there would be a failure of this particular search. And so what you see here is that there is basically a tail of 2s that extend past here. And so that contour associated with the phi equals 4, that would extend past the boundary of our search radius. And as a consequence, this would be rejected as a candidate and thus filtered out. Once we have those candidates, we then go to the stitch nodes algorithm, which again is this reduce operation in order to connect them in time. And so assuming, for instance, we have these detections at 0 hour, 6 hour, 12 hour, et cetera, up to 48 hour, within a search radius of each of those individual candidate points, we have to find at the next time slice the closest point, the closest candidate to that particular point. And then these are then connected in time in order to build tracks. We also have capacity to do gaps in the track, which may happen for tropical cyclones, for instance, that pass over a landmass and consequently weaken, but are nonetheless part of the same tropical disturbance. And so that even with this gap missing here, we can still nonetheless track over that 12-hour instance, connect those in time, and identify it as a singular track. If, for instance, here we have a track which is if, for instance, here we have a track that is too short, then that'll be rejected because it has to have a minimum duration of at least 24 hours, according to the stitch nodes command line. Okay, we can then take the output from stitch nodes and run it through some of our other tools. One of the tools that is commonly used for characterizing these features is node file filter, which basically generates aerial masks associated with the presence of these filters. So on the top left-hand side here, this is a sea level pressure field, and you may visually immediately distinguish some low pressure systems that pop out from this analysis. For instance, there's one here, and one here. These are tropical cyclone type features because of the depth of their low relative to the surrounding environment. But we also see some extratropical cyclone-like features, such as the one here, which you may not immediately visually distinguish, but Tempest Extremes identifies as being sufficiently closed in order to pass the criteria that we've specified for a closed contour, as well as one located over here. We can then basically build this 5-degree great circle distance blob around each of those detected nodal features in order to get this mask. There's other ways in order to build this mask as well. In fact, we can actually use the closed contour itself in order to build the mask, and that allows us to identify these 5 masks associated with a filter of closed contour depth 600 hectopascals, 600 pascals against the surrounding environment. And what you'll see for the tropical cyclones, they are very deep, isolated, very localized features, whereas the extratropical cyclones actually have fairly large footprint associated with them. We can then take those masks, in this case, the 5-degree mask, and apply that on top of the precipitation field. Here we do so simply by computing the product between the precipitation field and the mask, noting that the mask is 1, where you want to retain data, and 0 otherwise. And this then allows us to produce a net CDF file, which has this filtered precipitation. We can also composite the local fields associated with these individual nodal features, and that's done by building a stereographic grid atop every nodal feature, centered on each nodal feature, that then we regrid to that stereographic map and then overlay them on top of one another. If you look at the precipitation then associated with those 3 strongest tropical cyclones over 4 days of analysis, what you would get is something that looks like this, and already you can see some distinct structure showing up in these storms, including enhancement of precipitation to the east of the core of these tropical cyclones. There's a number of variable operations which are built into Tempest Extremes in order to make it easier to deal with data on the fly. I'm not going to go into all of them here, except to note that, of course, we have many kind of simpler operations as well as some more advanced calculus-based operations such as Laplacian curl, gradient magnitude, and vector dot gradient, which are used in various tracking algorithms throughout the literature. In order to obtain the Tempest Extremes code, you can either obtain it from Conda via the command lines indicated here, basically installing from Conda Forge the Tempest-Extremes package, or you can build from source with instructions given on the Tempest Extremes GitHub repository on how to do that source installation. I want to highlight some of the recent work that we've done with Tempest Extremes that showcases some of its capabilities. We have this manuscript currently under review, which was produced by my graduate student, Yushan Han, very talented fellow. And he basically came up with a generic low pressure system classification tool that used tracks from Tempest Extremes and basically classified all those low pressure systems by tropical cyclone, polar lows, easterly waves, extratropical cyclones, high altitude lows, and other types of features. And then look basically at the frequency climatology associated with those globally. And so you can actually download this if you're interested for ERA 5, and it shows these classified LPSs for use in research. We also use a tool called NCVis, which is available for quick look visualization of unstructured grid data. So this grid right here, or this data set right here, this is integrated water vapor obtained from an E3SM model run, which is our Department of Energy global climate modeling system, with regional refinement placed basically over this equatorial region right here. So you can see the coarser resolution of the data basically outside of that region. That's because the model itself is run with coarser resolution in that domain. This visualization is produced without any additional input from the users. All we do is use the latitude and longitude data from the data files produced by E3SM in order to produce this visualization. And it allows for basically interaction with the visualization in much the same way that you would use, for instance, NC View. So you can zoom in, highlight particular values, or basically look at different slices of the corresponding data. In addition, we're also working as part of the UXArray project, which is available via GitHub as well, on tools for working with unstructured grids, trying to, again, make it as easy for the user as possible and have them work with unstructured grids in much the same way that you would work with structured data. So we have a bunch of analysis operations now built into UXArray that work on unstructured grids and allow you to manipulate them in much the same way that you would a structured grid data product without having to do computationally intensive regridding operations prior to running that analysis. So you might want to check that out if you're interested, again, in working with native grid or unstructured grid data. With that, I will wrap up. So thank you very much for your time. I hope it's been valuable. And if you're interested in learning more or interested in using Tempest Extremes, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was very valuable. There's already a couple of questions on the chat by Lloyd. Lloyd, do you want to ask them yourself?
Yes, no, I first of all, thank you for the overview. I also have to start by saying I wish I was aware of your work earlier. So I'm an atmospheric modeler, so I use WRF and MPAS, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm also very familiar with all the standard tools. So one question I posted, you already answered. Okay, I've had a related question, which you've also already answered about the connections to UXArray, and I've talked to some of the people that have worked on that. So this is quite exciting. I think I'm kind of answering the question, like when you showed those initial results with tropical cyclones. It seems like you could sort of develop, apply your own metric to determine, how best to characterize what the let's say a path might be, so based on pressure or some other constraints. So if I'm interpreting what you've said, is that correct?
Yeah, actually, in Vishnu Nair's paper, they developed a tracking method for monsoon depressions and monsoon lows over India, and they weren't sure which field to use. And so they actually tried out 4 different fields. They looked at stream function, relative vorticity, sea level pressure, and I don't remember the fourth one. But basically, they came up with a set of reasonable values that they would use in the detection of these features. And then they ran basically multiple instances of Tempest Extremes, tracking with all these different thresholds and different fields. I think they ran several thousand different combinations,
Oh,
actually.
okay. All right.
And basically using some metric of success by comparing to a hand curated monsoon depression data set, they then eventually selected their optimal algorithm for the detection of these features.
Okay. Okay. So, oh, no, that's terrific. Because some of what you described, I and some of the members of my team, well, we've done things the old-fashioned way. We've developed our own, own code. Typically in Fortran or Python is model post-processing. So, well, we're definitely going to have to install this code and experiment with it. Some of our work is looking at modeling of extremes, particularly on much more local scales. So so this is more with WRF, where we're running at very high resolution. We may be looking for MCSs as an example, or in some of our other work, we're looking at in an urban environment, looking for pockets of high temperature, for example. So it'll be interesting to experiment with the tools. Do you know if some users have employed it for those kinds of applications?
I know of two contributions to Jifeng's MCS MIP that use Tempest Extremes. So if you're not familiar with MCS MIP, basically he's kicked off this project in order to do an intercomparison of MCS tracking algorithms.
Okay.
And it's
Oh
kind
yeah,
of,
no, I was not familiar with it. So
yeah.
so something else to look up.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, so he has his own MCS tracking algorithm called Flex Tracker. That's fairly robust. Really good tool. But yeah, I mean, there's again so many different thresholds and so many different options when it comes to actually deciding what you would like to define as an
Oh,
MC.
no, I understand. That's why I was so pleased to see that level of control and of course also being command line driven. The idea of being able to do automated processing and things of that sort. So it was great to see that that philosophy in your design. So
Yeah, we try to make things as easy as possible. Yeah. At least as I mentioned, basically one of the primary goals is trying to make it so that these unstructured grids aren't as daunting as kind of they're made out to be.
yeah,
And avoid a lot of the issues associated with data analysis on unstructured grids.
yeah.
I do a lot of work on regridding as well, and kind of acknowledge some of the issues that come up when you do have to regrid large data sets, and not only the computational expense, but it also smears out
Oh,
extremes.
yes. I've had similar debates, so I understand. So I've done some past work in visualization where the methods were designed to work, on the native grid. So when you said that up front, I got a big smile. So another question I had was, has the work been applied to non-atmospheric models?
Um, That's a good question, actually. And the only reason that I'm a little reluctant to say for sure is because the ocean folks that I've been working with over the past several months keep promising that they're using it for eddy tracking, or keep saying that they're interested in using it for eddy tracking, but they never actually have told me whether or not they've been successful with doing so.
Okay.
A reason why not. Again, the data, it uses unstructured grids. It doesn't care whether or not those unstructured grids have holes in them, as you would have in the case of continents. But I think that nobody's just actually really done it extensively, or have done it beyond basically just toy examples.
Okay, so the reason why I'm asking is that some of our work is around water resources. So we're doing, like within like a lake watershed. So we're running WRF at high resolution. We're using that to force WRF hydro, or mostly for runoff. And then both of those are forcing a lake hydrodynamics model. And we're using another open source package. We're using Suntans, and so for the specific implementation, it's using a triangular mesh, although it could be set up with a hexagonal mesh, and so that's why and that's horizontal, so not unlike something like MPass. So there are holes, if you will, depending on the water body, if around islands, which is why we're using the unstructured mesh. So higher resolution around, around the shorelines and around islands, for example.
Yeah, I would be very excited to see it applied in that context, particularly from an application scientist who, actually knows what they're looking for.
Well, we have there's a limnologist, a modeler on our team. That he's the one that's set up and suntan. So I'm letting him know about about your work, and he's often struggles with finding tools that know how to deal with the native mesh, and the output is in NetCDF. Following CF compliant attributes.
So it should work. It should work out of the
Yeah,
box.
that was my assumption, but he'll probably want to experiment with it. So I can put him in touch with you if if that's okay. If he has some useful results.
Sure, sounds good.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Is there any other question? Oh, yeah, can't see any. So I'll ask my own. So as you may have gathered, my interest is more in extreme dynamics discovery when you don't often know what exactly constitutes the extremality. And so I was wondering, so you have in this package a reduction capability that allows you to compute all sorts of statistics on the data. So can you connect that to the command line tool so that instead of asking for specific features of certain areas, certain pressure differences, etc., I will look for perturbations or deviations that are the 99th percentile or something like that. So it works out what a statistics is, and then it goes after the tails.
We do some of that, but it's a multi-step operation. So for instance, we would compute the 99th percentile of the field, and then basically use that as a threshold. So then you can do
Right.
things like, what is the difference? So you can just do like underscore DIFF of field, comma, climatology of that field, or 99th percentile
Yep.
climatology of that field,
I
and
see.
then set a threshold based on that instead.
Okay. Oh, that's great. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that came up quite a bit during the blocking research many years ago when we wanted to compute basically differences against a long-term daily mean climatology, again, where you have that seasonal variation in the background fields. And so it recognizes when it's a long-term daily mean climatology and basically does like a time slice matching.
Yeah.
So if it says my data is on January 1st, then use the long-term daily mean climatology from January 1st in order to compute that difference.
Right. No, that's great. I think that is incredibly useful because you don't always have an sort of prior knowledge about what you're interested in. And certainly in a climate change setting, you may be after things you haven't really seen much. You just want to see the deviations. You just want to see the places where things go extremely anomalous.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Are there more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
All right, go, Mike.
Yeah, so my background is it's more on groundwater, which is a little bit different, but we still work with grids. But I have a more question about the workflow. So you have everything with this command line tool. So this seems to be a prime thing to run the thing in a Python script in a Jupyter notebook where you can write documentation and you have very nice interactive help and all that kind of stuff. What's the experience? Because the command line getting interactive help is a bit difficult to always have to look up things in detail. So how's your experience in this workflow? Seems like only for experts.
I guess I'm not quite clear.
Usually, because I would expect that, because if you have very elaborated command line tools where you supply function calls with strings that you put in, there seems to be like an API for me, which would be the simplest to be used from a Jupyter notebook instead from the command line.
Yeah, we do have an API available through Python.
Yeah, so everything you showed there's a equivalent Python function with some help that pops up, and you can have a docstring everything, so it's easier.
Yeah. It can, of course, be done with system commands, but at least in my experience, the most valuable thing for users whenever trying to run this software is to have informative error messages. And so as I've written the software, basically, I've just made sure that all of the error messages are very clear about what exactly the issue is that the software is having with your particular input. And so it makes it very easy to go in. I mean, there's many instances where I'm like, oh, I haven't done this particular analysis in a while. Let me go in and just run detect nodes. And so if you just run detect nodes with no arguments, it already gives you the list of arguments that you can specify. And then when you do something erroneous, then it very much it pops up. Well, first of all, it tries to do the best that it possibly can. But if it's actually ambiguous as to what you're supposed to do, then it pops up with a very specific error message on what may be causing the issue, like some attribute is missing from the netcdf file, or you can't pair this particular argument with this particular structure of this of the data. And yeah, so when it comes to the Python interface, though, I'm sad to say, unfortunately, I'm not really much of a Python developer by training. I really want to do more Python development, but there just never seems to be enough time in the day. And so I outsourced that to a very enthusiastic student who was willing to actually develop a Python interface. And so we have that sitting in a GitHub repository somewhere.
I think you can pretty much automate it. There's good tools. You can write Python classes that wrap your C++ classes one-to-one, and then you have everything in Python that you don't have to write a lot of things behind. This can be mostly auto-generated, and then it's always up to date, everything. Thanks.
No problem.
Can I sneak in a last question if nobody else has anything to ask? I'm just wondering, what's your validation approach? Are you using sort of catalogs of extremes? You use other software you trust?
Usually whenever new functionality is implemented, I just work very closely with the person performing that analysis and insist basically that for their particular use cases, the results make sense and are consistent with what they're observing in their own workflows. Tempest Extremes is rarely used kind of as, oh, here's a problem, we've never done any work on it, we're just going to throw Tempest Extremes at it kind of out of the box. Instead, we've written a really slow Python code that kind of does what we want. And so we can use that as basically a validation. And running on many examples that are very short duration, we look at ERA5 data in particular and make sure that the results are consistent with expectations. I would really like to have a thorough test harness associated with Tempest Extremes, but just haven't had the time in order to do that development. So
That would be time consuming, yes.
yeah, we have a few test cases that we run regularly just to make sure that code modifications don't affect past examples, and that basically there's no change in the output for basically a standard set of test problems. But inevitably, I mean, despite my best efforts, bugs will always seep into the code somehow.
That's always the assumption, right? That's why you do validation.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, any very last question? I guess not. Then if that's the case, I would thank Paul again for his lovely presentation. Thanks so much for joining and talking, explaining and presenting Tempest Extreme to us. And then thank everyone else who's participated.
Yeah, so thank you. This has been a great talk today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you next month.
Thank you, Eloisa. Thank you.
Bye-bye.